The second big challenge is infrastructure. As many of you know, the World Economic Forum issues an annual competitiveness report. Transportation infrastructure is one of the categories they rank. And in this year's report, Chile, which again has the best rating for Latin America, is only 37th global best in infrastructure. Brazil ranks 67th, Peru 98th, and Colombia a woefully poor 101st. We all talk about how the commodities boom is fueling growth in Latin America as countries rush to export their rich natural resources to markets in Asia. But the fact is that getting goods from field or mine to ports in Latin America is extremely costly. At a recent business summit in Bogota, leaders noted, for example, that there is no road between Colombia and Brazil. In fact, it's actually slightly more costly to export to Brazil from Colombia than it is from Canada. Constructing, and in some cases modernizing the region's highways, airports, ports, and railroads is high on the business list of priorities. The business agenda also includes tax reform, labor reform, establishing a consistent regulatory environment. And this agenda is relevant not just in Latin America, but around the world, as a new private sector emerges. The Boston Consulting Group calls them the new global challengers, companies based in rapidly developing economies that are shaking up the established economic order. From Latin America, they include Mexico's Grupo Bimbo, the largest bread maker in the world, Brazil's JBS, the world's largest meat producer, Tenaris from Argentina, the largest manufacturer of seamless steel tubes for the energy sector, and Chile's LAN, soon to merge with TAM from Brazil to become one of the world's biggest airlines. In the list of 100 global challengers, these Latin champions join companies from China, India, and Russia, as you might expect, but also from Turkey, Thailand, Malaysia, South Africa, the United Arab Emirates, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Indonesia. These companies are global challengers because they are global success stories. From 2000 to 2009, both their revenues and their operating margins grew by 18% per year, triple the average annual growth rate of both their global peers and of non-financial firms in the S&P 500. And because they come from emerging markets, these global challengers have their pulse on and are particularly well placed to serve the new middle class, which will be 30% of the global population by 2020. If established multinationals from the US, Europe, and Japan are to continue to thrive alongside the global challengers, they need to rethink their own operations. Rethink what they mean when they talk about domestic versus foreign markets. For while their corporate headquarters may still be in the developed North, more and more of their revenues and an increasing number of their C-suite executives will come from the emerging South. We used to talk about the center of business, of growth and development, and the periphery of these activities. That distinction between center and periphery has totally blurred. And we're finding that change itself is an iterative process. The BRIC economies, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, went from making up about 8% of the world's real gross domestic product in 2000 to having a roughly 17% share in 2010. But impressive as that growth is, analysts are already seeing a more modest outlook for those big four. They're looking beyond the BRICS to what HSBC is calling the civets: Colombia, Indonesia, Vietnam, Egypt, Turkey, and South Africa. Or what Fidelity refers to as the mints: Mexico, Indonesia, Nigeria, and Turkey. And as these groups demonstrate new economic strength, their political reach and influence will grow as well. And this political role means that, like their private sectors, governments in the developed world are faced with adapting to the new order. Unfortunately, history has shown that governments aren't very nimble in that regard, and current events make clear their learning curve is still pretty steep. The United States, for example, has traditionally been the leading outside influence in Latin America. It now struggles to craft a new policy that approaches our hemispheric neighbors not as younger siblings who must be led, but as mature partners. While difficult, making that shift is essential for the United States, for the region, and for the world, because the countries of Latin America will be key to successfully managing some of the most pressing global problems. Take energy, where South America holds 20% of the world's proven oil resources, or food security, where the region accounts for 25% of the world's arable land, or climate change, where the Amazon rainforest alone produces more than 20% of the world's oxygen. For the future of all our hemisphere and its influence in the world, we must establish that mature partnership between our North and South. And no country is a more important place to start than Brazil. Brazil was the focus of a recent task force convened by the Council on Foreign Relations in which I participated. In our report called Global Brazil, we recommended strongly that the U.S. work with Brazil to address the challenges described above and to design the new global financial and political architecture, starting with the G20 and including the United Nations Security Council. Crafting this partnership will take work in Brazil as well. I used to say that Brazilians believe that if something were good for the United States, it must somehow be bad for Brazil, and they just had to find out what that bad angle was. Both sides need to lay aside old attitudes and old stereotypes. I'm convinced the payoff will be large and will have impact far beyond the borders of our two countries. Luis Alberto Moreno, president of the Inter-American Development Bank, recently channeled Horace Greeley by exhorting U.S. business and political leaders to go south, my friends, go south. I share in his guidance, but as I look around at my former colleagues in government, my current colleagues in business, and at leadership in various sectors in the United States, I want to say also, go east, go west, go up and explore the universe. Oh, and by the way, to keep our foundation strong, don't forget to also go home. In our globalized world, all are important. Thanks very much.
If you have a question ready, please raise your index card in the air. One of our volunteers will pick that up from you. And we will start with questions from our Suncoast High School students. So would the student ask the first question of our speaker?
Hi, my name is Andrew Howard Smith, and I'm a senior at Suncoast. We were wondering, with the given growth rate in Brazil, is this economic development being distributed equally to all income levels in Brazil?
I actually thought that question was going someplace else because a lot of people are looking at current growth rates in Brazil and saying, is this a bubble? And I have to, this is totally personal, but we're selling our house in Connecticut, right? Do you know how hard it is to sell a house in Connecticut these days? Okay. If anybody wants one, by the way. But we're trying to find a place to rent in Brazil. So we picked 3 houses out on a Monday afternoon. By Wednesday, they were all gone, and one of them that had been up for rent was sold because someone came along and said, oh, we'll buy that from you. And commercial real estate, we're looking for a new office. The vacancy rate is less than 1.5%. So there is a tremendous economic dynamism about Brazil, and a lot of people ask, is this for real? I'm convinced it's for real. At least I think it's going to take several years. We're going to have several years of good growth. But the answer to the question about how it's being distributed is, I think, illustrated in those statistics I gave about the number of people who came out of poverty into the middle class. I mean, over 40 million people. And that was a combination of raising the minimum wage, of creating conditional cash transfer programs so that families, wives, women, mothers were paid to keep their kids in school rather than put them out to work so the kids are better educated. And the economic growth where the private sector provided real job creation. There is still a long way to go. But the northeast of Brazil is no longer the highest concentration of poverty anywhere in the Western Hemisphere, and that's a tremendous achievement. And you all know this, the achievement came about under the presidency largely of Lula da Silva, right, who himself had a 5th grade education, but who ran on a platform of hope over fear. He was a leftist. He came from the Workers' Party. People were very afraid of what he might do once he became Brazil's president. What he did was set the government for the first time on a long-term path of economic growth and really paid attention to social inclusion, to bringing the poor people in. So I guess my answer to you would be, the short answer is, it's being better distributed. Is it being totally equally distributed? Absolutely not. And it's a free enterprise system too, so there's limits to what social policy is going to be able to achieve.
All right, thank you.
Second question from Suncoast High School.
Hello, my name is John Trimble. I'm a senior at Suncoast High School. And what do you think the United States government can learn from Latin American governments like Brazil that have been fighting economic poverty and unemployment for years? Can they learn for these tough times now?
It's an interesting question because the new head of the IMF, Christine Lagarde, is right now on her first tour of Latin America, and she has said that she wants to take lessons from Latin America back to the IMF. And now that the IMF is working with a number of economies in Europe, she thinks that Latin America has lessons for European countries that are in tough economic times. Yeah, I think the question has become, or the idea that Latin America has something to share with the U.S. and with Europe is somewhat chic now, right? But in fact, there have been incipient attempts to do this throughout the years. Even back when I was ambassador in the Dominican Republic, we had an excellent program working with single mothers in the Dominican Republic, providing them basic skills so that they could get jobs, making sure there were government facilities or employer-provided facilities for their children to have decent food and have some basic education. We took that program to Boston, where there were a lot of single mothers who also didn't have the skills to be able to get jobs adequate to contribute in a meaningful way to their families. So I think there are definitely lessons, not just on the economic side, but on the development side, on job creation and education that Latin America definitely can share with the United States. And this was supposed to be the beauty of the 1994 Summit of the Americas, that the United States came to the summit saying, look, we share these problems. We also need help in our education. We also need to reform health care. We also need to promote a culture of trade and export. As I said, some of that promise was realized in the various sectors, but just having that attitude and saying, what can we share, what can we learn from each other, I think goes a long way to creating this hemispheric partnership I talk about. So did that answer your question?
Yes.
Because you look real doubtful.
Well, so does the government. Thank you.
Donna, now some questions from our audience.
They're easier than these, right?
Yes,
Okay.
they are.